Spring of 1940, and the Royal Air Force faces a danger far deadlier than enemy fire. Pilots are returning from missions shaken, their reports confusing on paper but horrifying in practice. The Spitfire, Britain's newest hope in the skies, is being bested in ways no one anticipated. Against the Messerschmitt Bf 109, a single maneuver exposes a fatal flaw. Push the stick forward into a dive, and the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine chokes, coughs, and dies. For 5, maybe 10 seconds, a pilot is nothing but a glider, with a German fighter hot on their tail. 10 seconds feels like a lifetime when 20 million rounds are closing in at 600 miles per hour. By late March, Fighter Command has the grim statistics. Out of 73 confirmed clashes over France and the Channel, Spitfire engines faltered during -G dives in 61 cases, an 83% failure rate. In the middle of a dogfight, that often decides who shoots first and who doesn't shoot at all. Squadron leader Brian Lane of 19. Squadron files his report with urgent precision, coffee stains smudging the margins. The note reads like a warning from the front lines. The 109 dives. We follow. Engine dies. He's gone. We try to evade predictably because our planes won't obey us. This is the problem that draws Beatrice Schilling into the picture. On March 23, 1940, she's not supposed to be at RAF Tangmere. Yet the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farah has sent her to see the issue firsthand. At 29, she's already a motorcycle speed record holder at Brooklands, one of the few women engineers working on military planes. The RA types tolerate her brilliance. She holds a first-class honors degree in mechanical sciences from Manchester and, right now, her expertise in engine behavior under extreme stress is exactly what Britain needs. From the dispersal hut, Schilling watches Flight Lieutenant James Lethart demonstrate the flaw. His Spitfire Mark I climbs to 8,000 feet, rolls inverted, and pushes into a split S dive. The Merlin's roar twists into a strangled cough, black smoke streaking from the exhaust. Lethart levels off, the engine sputtering back to life after 7 excruciating seconds. On landing, Schilling is already waiting, notebook in hand, asking questions that cut straight to the heart of a problem pilots have endured, but never fully explained. It's not just the dive angle, she says, jotting notes with quiet clarity. It's the acceleration vector, Schilling explains, her finger tracing invisible lines in the air. The moment the aircraft experiences -G, the fuel flow interrupts. That means you can't push the stick. You can't chase. You can't exploit any advantage that demands forward pressure. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe has no such problem. Their Daimler-Benz DB601 engines use direct fuel injection, delivering fuel straight into the cylinders no matter how the plane twists or turns. Messerschmitt pilots can push, pull, roll through every axis without their engines skipping a beat. In the deadly chess game above southern England, the Germans are moving every piece while the RAF is stuck playing half the board blindfolded. That evening, Schilling returns to Farnborough with oil stains on her coveralls, and the problem has suddenly turned personal. The Rolls-Royce Merlin is a marvel of 1930s engineering, but it's built on an idea that predates the Wright brothers. The carburetor is elegant in its simplicity. Air rushes through a narrowed throat, creating low pressure that pulls fuel from a reservoir into the airstream. The mixture atomizes, flows into the cylinders, and ignites. Under normal conditions, it's flawless. Every car, lawnmower, generator, even small engines in 1940 rely on this same principle. Gravity keeps fuel sitting where it needs to be. Now flip that assumption upside down. Push a Spitfire into -G, and everything loose in the cockpit floats. Maps, dust, even the pilot's lunch. Inside the carburetor's float chamber, fuel behaves the same way. It sloshes to the top, leaving the pickup points empty. The carburetor is still trying to pull fuel that isn't there. Air rushes through without it. The mixture goes lean, combustion temperatures spike, The engine detonates unevenly. And then, silence. For a few seconds, the engine stops. In combat, 3 seconds of dead power means losing 400 feet of altitude and handing your firing solution to the enemy. On April 2, 1940, Schilling runs the numbers at Farnborough. The Merlin's float chamber holds roughly 0.8 liters of fuel. At normal draw, that's enough for 12 seconds of operation. The float valve refills the chamber constantly as the carburetor feeds the engine. Under 1G, fuel rests at the bottom of the chamber, hydrostatic pressure pushing roughly 1.2 pounds per square inch toward the jets. Perfect. But in a negative G dive, everything changes in an instant. Push the Spitfire into negative G, even for a heartbeat, and everything flips. The pressure inside the float chamber inverts. Fuel is forced upward while the jets still try to draw it downward. Physics doesn't negotiate. The fuel separates from the pickup, the engine starves, and a plane that should dominate the skies suddenly becomes a liability. The German solution, direct fuel injection, sidesteps the problem entirely. The Daimler-Benz DB601 uses a mechanical pump to pressurize fuel to 30 psi, delivering it straight into each cylinder through individual injectors. Gravity? Irrelevant. The engine keeps running smoothly whether the plane is climbing, diving, or inverted. A Bf-109 can fly upside down for minutes, pull negative G until the pilot nearly blacks out from blood rushing to his head, and the engine doesn't even notice. It's superior technology, mechanically intricate and costly. Each DB601 demands precision-machined pumps, 9 perfectly calibrated injectors, and maintenance by trained specialists. The Luftwaffe built their entire tactical doctrine around this advantage. Pilots were drilled to exploit it ruthlessly. Push into negative G the instant a Spitfire tries to tail them, and watch the British engine fail predictably every time. Back at Farnborough, Schilling's early April notes show she's onto a new theory: flow restriction. If the carburetor is delivering too much fuel too fast during maneuvers, that excess fuel sloshes around, starving the engine. Maybe, she reasons, limiting the maximum flow could stabilize the float chamber. It's counterintuitive, reducing fuel to fix a fuel starvation problem. But the physics suggest it might work. The question: how do you test it without rebuilding an entire carburetor? And who at the Royal Aircraft Establishment would let a junior engineer with unconventional ideas touch a Merlin engine worth more than a house? The answer arrives on April 9, 1940. A 40-page technical proposal from the RAE, formal, detailed, and heavy with possibility. Senior engineers at the Royal Aircraft Establishment convene, call in Rolls-Royce men from Derby, and produce the sort of thorough, cautious fix bureaucracies do best: redesign the whole carburetor. Their plan reads like an engineering thesis. A pressure-balanced float chamber, spring-loaded baffles, anti-slosh compartments, and a reworked fuel delivery system that will keep positive pressure no matter how the airframe flips. Time to develop: 8 to 11 months. Cost: about $47 a unit. Production impact: Supermarine Spitfire lines would stop for 6 to 8 weeks while Rolls-Royce retooled. It's May 1940. France is falling. The British Expeditionary Force is about to be driven toward Dunkirk. Fighter Command has 331 serviceable Spitfires, and they are being lost faster than factories can replace them. An 11-month redesign is not a solution. It's bureaucracy dressed up as a death sentence. Squadron leaders scream for anything that will let pilots follow and fight without their engines conking out. The establishment answers with another committee to review implementation for a fix that won't exist until 1941. Beatrice Schilling reads that 40-page proposal in her Farnborough workshop and makes a choice that will define her career. She will not publicly defy the senior engineers. She knows the politics and the weight of 30 years' experience. But she will ignore the slow, elegant solution and try something of her own. If her hunch pays off, she reasons, the ornate official answer will look exactly like what it is, an over-engineered luxury the service cannot afford right now. Her idea is disarmingly simple. If fuel slosh inside the float chamber causes starvation during negative G, and if excess fuel volume makes that slosh worse, then limit how much fuel can enter the chamber in the first place, not with springs and compartments, but with a blunt mechanical limiter, a tiny washer with a precision-drilled hole placed in the fuel line feeding the carburetor. The restriction caps the maximum flow, preventing the chamber from overfilling, and therefore reducing the amount of fuel available to surge away from the jets. The engine may still cut out under the worst pulls, but the blackout drops from 7 seconds to 2. 2 seconds a pilot can survive. 7 seconds that will often kill you. The RA brass would call it crude, a plumber's trick for an aerospace problem. That's exactly why Schilling doesn't ask permission. On May 4, 1940, she requisitions a brass disc from the machine shop, filing the paperwork as test material for fuel flow analysis. Back at her little workshop, a shed behind her, flat where she rebuilds motorcycle engines, she spends the evening with drill bits and calipers. The math points to a hole only a few thousandths of an inch across, a tiny calculated restriction that might just stop the float chamber from turning the Spitfire into a glider at the worst possible moment. Too small, and the engine starves at full throttle. Too large, and the negative G problem remains. Schilling drills 6 test washers, each with a slightly different diameter: 0.55, 0.57, 0.60, 0.63, 0.65, and 0.68 inches. By May 7th, she has a small arsenal of brass discs, oversized pennies with holes punched in the center, each costing about 3 pence to make. Each one can be installed in 15 minutes by any mechanic with a wrench, and each one might just fix the problem that is robbing Fighter Command of its tactical edge in a battle that could determine Britain's survival this summer. All she needs now is someone willing to let her bolt one onto a Merlin engine and see what happens when you push the stick forward. That pilot turns out to be Jeffrey de Havilland Jr., chief test pilot at the Airborne Forces Experimental Establishment. Son of the legendary aircraft designer, de Havilland carries enough institutional weight to greenlight an unofficial modification, without immediately triggering inquiries from the Air Ministry. On May 14, 1940, Schilling arrives at Hatfield Aerodrome, her leather tool roll cradling the collection of brass washers. De Havilland has already heard whispers about the female engineer who tears down motorcycle engines for sport and asks uncomfortable questions about why the RA's official carburetor fix won't be ready until spring 1941. The test aircraft is a Spitfire Mark I, serial number K9795, freshly pulled from a production batch destined for 54 Squadron. Schilling and mechanic Albert Foley install the 0.060-inch washer in 22 minutes. It slips into the fuel line between the engine-driven pump and the carburetor inlet. The brass disc is slightly thicker than a Schilling, simple, unassuming, and soon to be known by pilots and engineers alike as the washer. It doesn't touch the carburetor, the float chamber, or any of Rolls-Royce's finely tuned metering systems. It simply limits the fuel flow, keeping the float chamber stable during negative G dives. At 11:30 a.m., de Havilland climbs into K9795. The test protocol is clear and terrifying. Ascend to 10,000 feet, roll inverted, push into negative G, and hold as long as the engine will run. Without the washer, the Merlin would sputter and die within 3 or 4 seconds. Schilling stands on the tarmac, stopwatch and binoculars in hand, watching as the Spitfire rises through broken clouds, levels out, and rolls inverted. Every second now counts like a lifetime. She hears the Merlin change pitch as de Havilland pushes the stick forward. A single cough, a hiccup. Then it keeps singing. 4 seconds. 5. At 8 seconds he rolls upright and the engine smooths out like a throat clearing. He makes 3 more runs, each one holding negative G longer than the last. The longest run reaches 11 seconds before he breaks off, not because the engine died, but because sustaining that attitude that long is brutal on both airframe and pilot. He touches down 28 minutes after takeoff and taxis in with a grin that says everything before he speaks. It still hesitates, he tells them, but it doesn't quit. Held negative G through a full split S, and the Merlin stayed alive. Rough, but alive. Schilling asks the practical question. What about full throttle performance? Does the restriction starve the engine when it matters most? De Havilland shakes his head. Top speed is unchanged. Climb seems slightly sharper, probably because the mixture runs a touch leaner and more efficiently. Over the next 3 days, they trial all 6 washers. The 0.55-inch disc strangles the engine at altitude, above 20,000 feet. The thin air makes mixture balance critical, and it loses power. The 0.68-inch disc doesn't cure the negative G cut convincingly. The 0.60-inch washer proves the sweet spot. Just enough restriction to stop the float chamber flooding, but not so much that the engine suffers under combat power. By May 17, Schilling has her answer. A brass disc costing about 3 pence, fitted in 15 minutes by any mechanic, fixes roughly 80% of the carburetor's negative G failures. A field tweak that Ray's committee expects to take 11 months, and 47 per unit to solve. The final question is the only one that matters. How does it perform in real combat? On May 20th, she walks into RAF Duxford with her data and asks squadron leader Brian Lane for a trial. He's wary. 9 years in the RAF have taught him that. Simple fixes often bring messy surprises, but he's desperate enough to try anything that might keep pilots alive. Lane authorizes the installation of the Schilling-sized washers on 6 operational Spitfires. The test won't be a tidy bench trial. It will be decided at 300 miles an hour under fire, where negative G moves are split-second life-or-death choices. The trouble with revolutionary ideas is that they threaten people who've built careers on convention. When Schilling's modification reaches the Air Ministry in late May 1940, the reaction ranges from wary skepticism to open hostility. Senior engineers at the Royal Aircraft Establishment dismiss it as crude, argue that it doesn't address the real cause of carburetor starvation, and warn that installing unapproved modifications on frontline fighters violates every aircraft certification protocol. One memo dated May 28th and authored by an RA department head whose name is carefully redacted in declassified files, calls Schilling's washer a plumber's bodge, a temporary patch that might mask the problem while introducing unknown catastrophic failures. Around this time, the term Miss Schilling's orifice appears, not as a compliment. RAF mechanics coin it first, half mocking the notion that a problem supposedly requiring Rolls-Royce's finest minds could be solved by a woman with a drill press. The insult is layered, as much about sexism as disbelief. It's 1940. Britain is fighting for survival, and institutional misogyny still finds time to leak into language. Schilling, true to form, ignores the sniping. She's too busy installing washers on every Spitfire squadron leader Lane can authorize. Lane doesn't care about Air Ministry etiquette. His focus is on keeping pilots alive. The first combat test comes on June 3, 1940, over Dunkirk. Flight Lieutenant James Coward, flying a modified Spitfire, encounters a Bf-109E at 8,000 feet. The German pilot performs his usual escape. Roll inverted. Push into a split S dive. Coward follows, stick forward, expecting the Merlin to cough and die. It hesitates for barely a second, runs rough, then holds steady. He trails the enemy. Through the entire dive, closes to 200 yards, and fires a precise 3-second burst that tears through the Messerschmitt's left wing. The Bf-109 spins into the channel. Coward returns to Duxford and files a succinct report. Engine modification performs as advertised. Maintain pursuit through negative G maneuvers that would previously have forced breakoff. Recommend immediate installation across squadron. By mid-June, the news spreads through fighter command like wildfire. Pilots talk, and what they're saying is clear. 19 squadron Spitfires can now do things that were impossible just weeks ago. Squadron commanders start calling Farnborough directly, bypassing the bureaucratic chain, demanding washers for their aircraft. The RA digs in, insisting on exhaustive testing protocols, failure mode analysis, and certification processes that would take months. Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding cuts through the red tape with a June 20th directive. Install Schilling's modification on all operational Spitfires immediately. Testing can come later. Right now, pilots need every possible advantage.
Production becomes the bottleneck. Machining 0.060-inch brass washers isn't difficult, but Britain's factories are already running 3 shifts producing everything from bomb fuses to gun barrels. Schilling personally supervises the first batch, 5,000 washers manufactured by Birmingham Metal Works, a plant usually devoted to plumbing fixtures. A simple brass disc, 3 pence in cost, now carries the weight of Britain's aerial survival on its tiny shoulders. The irony of producing a cutting-edge aerospace modification in a plumbing factory isn't lost on anyone. Installation teams crisscross airfields, fitting washers between combat sorties. A Spitfire lands, refuels, and rearms. While the pilot sips tea and fills out combat reports in the dispersal hut, a mechanic is crouched beneath the cowling, slipping in a 3-pence brass disc that might save that pilot's life on the next mission. By August 1st, 1940, roughly 70% of operational Spitfires carry the modification. Combat reports show immediate, measurable improvement. Pilots are flying more aggressively, holding on to engagements that would previously have forced a disengagement. The negative G engine cut hasn't vanished, but it's now a brief hesitation rather than a mission-ending failure. More crucially, RAF pilots regain confidence in their aircraft. A pilot who knows his engine will quit under pressure second-guesses every tactical choice. A pilot who knows it may hesitate but won't fail flies instinctively, every split-second decision sharper. The proof arrives in blood and wreckage over the Channel. On August 11th, 1940, the day the Luftwaffe designates Adler Eagle Day, the start of their major campaign to destroy the RAF, the tactical landscape has quietly shifted. Oberleutnant Franz Vona, a seasoned Bf 109 pilot with 13 confirmed kills, engages a Spitfire from 72 Squadron at 12,000 feet. He executes the maneuver that has worked flawlessly for months, inverted roll into a negative G dive, expecting the British engine to fail and the Spitfire to break off. But the Spitfire follows. Vona expects black smoke, hesitation, failure, nothing. The British fighter stays glued to his tail, closing distance. Vona pulls into a climbing turn, already on the defensive, reacting instead of controlling the fight. Pilot Officer Ronald Hamlin fires a 4-second burst from 150 yards. Cannon shells rip through Vona's cockpit canopy and engine cowling. The Bf 109 belly lands in a Kent pasture. Vona becomes a prisoner of war. Vona eventually escapes, returning to Germany to file detailed reports of the encounter. Luftwaffe intelligence initially dismisses his claims that Spitfires can now maintain negative G maneuvers. Their assessments rely on captured Spitfires from May and June, aircraft that flew before Schilling's washers reached operational squadrons. By August, the reality has changed, but the Germans are still operating on 2-month-old assumptions. The numbers tell the story. From May 1st to July 31st, Fighter Command logs 147 engagements in which Spitfires experienced engine failures during negative G maneuvers. From August 1st to October 31st, during the height of the Battle of Britain, that number plummets to 39. The modification hasn't eliminated the problem entirely, but it has cut failure rates by 73%, a simple, brilliant fix that turned Britain's fighters from fragile prey into resilient hunters. Even more striking than the drop in failure rates is the reduction in duration of engine cuts from an average of 5.8 seconds to just 1.4. In the razor-thin margins of aerial combat, those 4 seconds are everything. the difference between getting your shot or taking one. The tactical impact is immediate and dramatic. On August 24th, Pilot Officer Eric Mars of 100 Squadron engages 3 Bf-109s over Manston at 15,000 feet. Outnumbered and on the defensive, he searches for an escape. One Messerschmitt dives from above. Standard doctrine would have him roll away and dive with positive G, accepting separation and hoping to outrun the pursuer. Instead, Mars rolls inverted, pushes forward, and drives straight at the German fighter. The Merlin coughs once, a brief hiccup, then steadies. The Bf-109 pilot, expecting the Spitfire to fail, reacts too late. Mars opens fire head-on, forcing the German to break off. Reversing quickly, Mars finds himself on the tail of a second 109, scoring hits on 2 aircraft before returning safely to base, an encounter that would have ended in disaster just weeks earlier. September 15, 1940, later commemorated as Battle of Britain Day, sees 56 confirmed Luftwaffe losses over southern England. Flight records show that in at least 19 of these engagements, Spitfire pilots used negative G maneuvers enabled by the carburetor modification to maintain pursuit, actions that would previously have been impossible. That's 19 enemy aircraft destroyed that might otherwise have escaped. Over the entire 3-month period of intense fighting, Schilling's simple brass washer may have shaped the outcome of 150 to 200 engagements. Squadron leader Brian Lane, who greenlit the first combat trials back in May, writes to Schilling in late September. His letter is brief, typed on official RAF stationery, formatted in a way that shows he wrote it himself rather than delegating. Your modification has kept pilots alive and aircraft operational. The mathematics of survival don't measure elegance, they measure effectiveness. Thank you for understanding the difference. The letter arrives at Farnborough on September 28th. Schilling files it in her desk drawer, never showing it to the senior engineers who spent the summer insisting her solution was crude and inadequate. The institutional lesson takes years to sink in, and even then reluctantly. Miss Schilling's orifice works. It saves lives. It wins battles. And yet it offends engineers trained to believe that proper solutions demand comprehensive analysis, systematic redesign, and mechanical elegance. Some truths, it seems, are too simple to be polite. A brass washer with a hole drilled through it has none of the elegance, precision, or sophistication prized by engineers. It's a restriction, a compromise, a band-aid that treats the symptom rather than the root cause. Yet it saves lives. It wins battles. Beauty, in engineering circles, matters almost as much as function, and for a certain type of engineer, this washer was an affront to taste. Rolls-Royce eventually delivers the perfect solution. By March 1941, the Bendix-Strawberg pressure carburetor arrives, a sophisticated system of fuel pumps and pressure regulators that maintains a flawless mixture regardless of aircraft attitude. Engineered, tested, certified, elegant. It costs £43 per unit, requires specialized installation, and needs recalibration every 100 flight hours. Schilling's washer? 3 pence, installs in 15 minutes, and never needs attention. Both work. One is superior in the eyes of an engineer. The other won the Battle of Britain. The contrast exposes a deeper truth about problem-solving under pressure. The establishment approach, comprehensive analysis, optimized design, perfect execution, thrives when there is time to spare. It produces marvels like the later Merlin variants, with 2-stage superchargers and advanced fuel systems, engines that represent the pinnacle of piston aviation. But in May 1940, with France collapsing and Fighter Command losing pilots faster than they could replace them, that method would have delivered its solution 9 months too late. Schilling's approach: identify the minimum viable intervention that fixes the critical failure, deliver results in 3 weeks. This isn't an argument against rigor or sophistication. The Bendix-Strawberg carburetor is objectively superior. What Schilling shows is that superior and adequate occupy very different positions on the timeline of urgent need. Fighter Command didn't need the perfect carburetor in June 1940. They needed a working carburetor. Adequate was enough to keep Britain fighting until superior could arrive. Over the next decade, the aerospace industry slowly absorbs this lesson. The principles that guided Schilling, rapid, practical solutions to critical problems, echo in the secret labs of Lockheed Skunk Works in 1943 and beyond. Elegance will always have its place. But sometimes, a threepence brass washer is all that stands between survival and defeat. Fast iteration, minimal bureaucracy, solutions that value function over elegance. That's the lesson Kelly Johnson, legendary director of Lockheed's Skunk Works, carried through his career. On his desk sat a brass disc, a replica of Miss Schilling's orifice, gifted by a British colleague in 1946. Whenever engineers proposed elaborate fixes to urgent problems, Johnson would tap the disc and ask, "Are you designing for perfection, or are you designing for delivery?" The question cut through indecision like a razor. Modern Formula One racing carries the same principle. Teams spend hundreds of millions developing engines with pneumatic valves, hybrid power units, and microsecond-precise fuel injection. And yet, in the middle of a Grand Prix, they rely on aluminum tape, cable ties, and quick fixes that would horrify aerospace engineers, because reliability under stress is what wins races. Schilling understood this in 1940. Complexity may impress the mind, but simplicity under pressure saves lives. The irony is striking. Schilling's humble brass washer remains in some ways more robust than its sophisticated successor. The Bendix-Strawberg carburetor is a marvel, but it carries multiple potential failure points: pump malfunction, pressure regulator failure, diaphragm rupture, accelerator sticking. Miss Schilling's orifice has only one, the washer physically breaking, something that requires stresses so extreme the rest of the engine would already be destroyed. Fewer moving parts, fewer things that can fail. Reliability through simplicity, obvious once stated, yet often forgotten in engineering culture seduced by complexity. Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, in his post-war memoirs of 1946, dedicated 3 paragraphs to her work. Miss Schilling's contribution exemplified practical thinking that kept fighter command operational during our most desperate period. History will remember the Spitfire's grace and the Hurricane's ruggedness. Those of us there will remember the threepence brass washer that allowed both aircraft to fight as their designers intended. It is one of the few instances where a senior commander explicitly credits an engineer by name for tactical advantage in combat. Beatrix Schilling returned to peacetime obscurity with the same quiet competence that had defined her wartime contribution. In 1948, she was awarded the OB, Order of the British Empire, for her services to aircraft engineering. The citation was brief, noting her work on engine performance under combat conditions, without ever mentioning the small brass washer that had influenced hundreds of aerial engagements. She attended the investiture at Buckingham Palace, received her medal from King George VI, and returned the next day to Farnborough to continue her work on jet engine development. The ceremony received 2 paragraphs in the Times, buried on page 11 between notices about agricultural subsidies and railway timetables. Post-war, she shifted her focus to jet propulsion and supersonic flight research, quietly continuing the same practical, disciplined brilliance that had kept Britain's Spitfires in the fight. After the war, Schilling continued shaping Britain's aviation future, though her work rarely made headlines. She contributed to the development of the de Havilland Ghost engine, helped pioneer early studies of afterburners, and refined test protocols for jet engine performance at transonic speeds. These were vital, highly classified projects that nudged Britain toward the jet age, but history largely forgot them. By 1950, RAF pilots flying Spitfires had no idea why a brass washer still sat in their fuel lines. They only knew regulations required it. Schilling's wartime innovation had quietly become invisible infrastructure, taken for granted. She retired from the Royal Aircraft Establishment in 1969 after 39 years of service. Her declassified personnel file, released in 2003, paints a picture of technical reliability and steady competence, faint praise that understated the revolutionary impact of her work. One 1952 review noted her impatience with procedural requirements, a polite way of saying she still valued practical solutions over bureaucratic elegance. Her superiors never fully forgave her for being right in ways that made the establishment look foolish. Outside the labs, motorcycles remained her passion. She raced at Brooklands throughout the 1950s, eventually moving to trials riding and hill climbs. In 1965, at age 54, she set a speed record for women over 50 on a Norton Dominator at Silverstone, 118 miles per hour on a bike she had rebuilt herself in her garage. The motorcycle press celebrated it far more than the aviation journals ever had. There was something irresistibly heroic about a grandmother in a leather suit outrunning men half her age, a public imagination captivated by grit and daring rather than fuel flow calculations. Beatrix Schilling passed away on November 18, 1990, at the age of 79. Her obituaries were brief. The Times devoted just 4 paragraphs, noting her OBE and describing her as an engineer who contributed to aircraft development during the Second World War. Yet behind those quiet lines lay the story of a woman whose sharp mind, courage, and practicality had changed the course of aerial combat and whose influence rippled through aviation history long after the headlines faded. The Daily Telegraph ran 6 short paragraphs in 1990, including a photograph of Schilling standing beside a Spitfire. The caption got the squadron wrong, and, tellingly, nowhere did it mention her famous modification. By then, the double entendre of Miss Schilling's orifice was already a historical footnote, too crude or forgotten for public print. Recognition came slowly, and mostly after she was gone. In 2013, the Royal Academy of Engineering honored her in their Engineering Heritage Series, mounting a blue plaque on the site of the former RAE Farnborough building where she had worked. In 2017, the Brooklands Museum spotlighted her in an exhibition celebrating women in motorsport and engineering. The Imperial War Museum added her story to its Battle of Britain displays in 2020, 8 decades after the brass washer she devised had altered the tactical balance over southern England. Modern engineering students sometimes encounter her story in case studies on rapid prototyping and minimum viable solutions, though the misogyny she faced is often left out of the lesson. Original brass washers from 1940, stamped with RAF inventory numbers, have become collector's items, selling for hundreds of pounds. Museums display them alongside Merlin engine cutaways and Spitfire propellers. Tiny brass discs with simple holes, seemingly unremarkable objects, each representing a decision, to deliver an adequate solution immediately, rather than waiting for a perfect one. Each washer symbolizes ignoring institutional hierarchy in favor of practical results, understanding that elegance matters less than effectiveness, especially when lives hang in the balance. Beatrix Schilling herself probably would have found posthumous accolades amusing. She didn't set out to be heroic. She solved a problem with the tools and knowledge at hand. That it worked doesn't make her special. It made the problem worth solving. Her career was defined by one belief: engineering is about making things work, not taking credit for it. And in this case, a 3-pence brass washer and an afternoon at a drill press was exactly enough. It kept pilots flying and Britain in the fight.